worries. Right, so welcome everyone. I was going to say good afternoon, but then I realized that Larry is almost about to go to bed probably. So yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and to some good night to this meeting that Matt has kindly asked me to chair today. And I think that Matt, before we start with the discussion, is going to present a little bit of the information that he gathered together with Larry in the last meeting they had with researchers and clinicians interested in eye tracking in the Pacific, in Australia, New Zealand, India, and the US. So if Matt can share this information, and then we'll go ahead.
Right, thank you. Yeah, so I won't go through the entire purpose of ISCET because we've had 2 meetings now kind of going through that. But just to fill in, the last meeting was to suit really the Indo-Pacific region. We had 20 people attend that. Larry, feel free to kind of fill in if I make any mistakes in terms of what happened in that meeting. Larry was chairing that meeting. Initially, the initial purpose was kind of a replication of the first meeting, which obviously didn't suit that region so well in terms of the time slot. And just to see if there was an agreement with what we agreed in the first meeting here, which was that there should be ISCET should exist for a start for producing guidelines or clinical standards for clinical eye tracking techniques. Ruth attended that one as well and repeated her talk that she gave at the first message as well, which was how ISEV has come into being and how ISEV defines standards for the electrophysiology literature. So just to bring some points that were raised in that discussion, it was noted that for ISEV, for electrophysiology, a different standard is present for each technique, whereas in eye tracking, it's often the same technique being applied to different use cases. So a neurologist would use the same piece of equipment that a psychologist would use, and they'd be looking at completely different things. So it wouldn't necessarily be broken down by equipment, but rather broken down by use case for in an ISCET case. I'll just go through the points that are on the website in regards to what were raised. It may be possible to define some core standards which apply to all subdisciplines and then have additional guidance for each individual use case. There's only helpful to really have tests for disciplines that have a clinical utility. So one of the first things that we'll need to determine, and that now really is the focus of this meeting, is what should the priorities of ISCET be in terms of which clinical disciplines require guidance most urgently, I would say, at this point. At the very first meeting, we talked about whether ISCET would try to tackle, all the subdisciplines at once, or maybe try focusing on one to start with, learn from that process, and then be able to maybe then split out to tackle other subdisciplines. So really what we would need to do at this stage is come up with a prioritized list of which disciplines require guidance more than others. It was also noted, just in terms of structural stuff, that we've got an alternating meeting time at the moment between a kind of European-centric slot and now one that is in the Indo-Pacific region. But that does potentially exclude colleagues in America. So we may want to have a third meeting time at some point with an American colleagues. And I don't think I see anyone here from America, which may be telling of the fact that the time slot might not be ideal.
I'm from America.
Oh, hello. Sorry. Robert. Yes,
yeah, no, you can.
Are you East Coast? I'm trying to look at the wind outside.
I'm East Coast. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this is a fake background though.
Oh, okay.
Can't tell from the light. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. So so far, I've been trying to get people to kind of take on the chairing responsibility and make this kind of a fully collaborative effort. My intention is not to lead this in the long term, and it would be really great to have people emerge in each area who could potentially take on that sort of thing. So, Robert, not to put you on the spot, but if you fancy chairing a meeting for the Americas at some point, you'd be very welcome to do that. And I would, of course, attend and kind of provide that link between the different sessions as much as I can. What else was said? So yeah, really, we also actually, one thing that Larry did last time, which was really helpful, was to go through everyone who was present at the meeting. We had only 20 people there, which was less than the 70 we had previously at this one. So it was possible to go through everybody's disciplines and work out what was covered. I'm not going to just read those out. What I will do is just pop that in the chat so you can see the notes from the previous meeting, which is what I'm currently looking through. But there was quite a good spread, actually. I was concerned that because of my interest in nystagmus and, just rallying people that I know from the area, there was going to be an awful lot of nystagmus representation, and there is. However, what we need to, if ISCET is supposed to cover all clinical eye tracking uses, and that was something that was agreed at the first meeting, rather than trying to focus on particular disciplines, then we need to make sure that the first standards to be developed are actually the most urgent to be developed. And that isn't necessarily going to be gotten by having a survey of the people in the meetings to say, what is it that you do? What are your priorities? Because that may end up just being a little bit more nystagmus centric. So it was felt that the main thrust of today's meeting would then be, okay, how can we actually characterize current clinical eye tracker use around the world? And then we can couple that information, once we have it, with which are the disciplines which patients would most urgently benefit from guidance for. And by putting those bits of information together, we can hopefully then decide which discipline requires guidance to be developed first. That is my recollection mostly of the meeting. Larry, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think obviously I'm interested in nystagmus. But like one other example I can think of, I was involved in a clinical trial where a parameter related to saccadic peak velocity was the primary outcome measure. And that was at least accepted in Europe, but not in the US. So that there's probably potential for that sort of thing to be used clinically, and that anything involving clinical trials, I think having a standard would be really valuable when taking the data to the regulatory authorities.
Yeah, I think with the first two meetings kind of focused on whether or not there was a need for clinical eye tracking, and I actually thought there would be a little more equivalence than there was. I mean, it was overwhelming. We had 35 votes in favor of forming a society versus 1 against in the first meeting, and that was we kind of cut the voting before we even got to everyone, because it was already more than half of those present. So it was I think the benefits of actually having standardization seem to be overwhelmingly understood by the group. So now it's really a case of focusing on what are the disciplines that we need to focus on most. Okay, I will take a step back at this point and pass back over to Flores, who will be chairing this meeting. I'll be taking minutes, and I'll upload anything on the website at the end as well.
Thanks, Matt, for this comprehensive review of the meeting you hosted with Larry in the Pacific. So yeah, I suppose that after your introduction, we now only need to start discussing a little bit about what are the actual current clinical uses of eye tracking internationally. So, and then trying to set up this list of clinical priorities and start working towards perhaps the first couple of 3-4 priorities, and then tackle each priority at once rather than trying to go with everything. So the room is open for discussion. If anyone has, we've heard from Matt and Larry that of course their clinical as well as research interest is nystagmus, and I'm sure that there is definitely a need for standardization there. But is there anyone else in the actual room who has any other suggestions or works in eye tracking but outside of nystagmus that considers the standardization is needed? So other than nystagmus, I work in pediatrics, so, and I actually also think that there is a need for standardization there. And I believe that in the first meeting that I was there, some people from more fields, I believe, they were also making some comments about trying to conduct eye tracking clinically to children, and then using very different approaches across the board. So that's also one of my clinical interests. Perhaps is not as needed as in nystagmus, but I also think that in terms of pediatrics, there is also a need to standardize and characterize a little bit more the approaches that we have or that we use currently in eye tracking. So other than me, is everyone else involved in nystagmus? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not nystagmus, but I So I'm more of a basic science researcher in eye tracking in general. So I've done a little clinical applications for it, but it's more like coming up with ocular motor signatures for whatever clinical condition, irrespective of condition. And so from my end, actually that work tends to be very exploratory, which means it's by definition harder to say, I'm going to require there to be standardization here, right?
Yeah. What about people working on cognitive deficits, neurodegenerative diseases? Is there anyone who, because I've just read a pile of articles on eye movement in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and again I come across lots of articles, lots of papers that they do very much different tests, different approaches, different eye tracking systems, and it always crosses my mind how I can actually compare results here and there. So I don't know whether anyone here is involved in that sort of research and has any more insight into this or any other condition.
Have been in the past, and a lot of those paradigms are various saccade tasks. Not so much reflexive, but say anti-saccade, remembered saccade, predictive. And so that's actually, again, an area where I know there's been an effort to optimize anti-saccades, but for the other paradigms, I don't think there has been. Another area which probably is being commercialized probably before the research has really been done well is concussion detection. Everyone and his dog seems to be developing either a device or an app that will diagnose a football player who's been hit in the head too often. And I think the absence of standards in that area is able to come back and haunt people at some point. But that's certainly a different application that probably would merit some attention for standardization.
I would agree with you on that, Larry. It seems to me that unlike the previous initiative that Matt so well sort of progressed with respect to guidelines for the actual tracking of eyes, it seems to me that in the clinical scenario, and I myself am not a clinician, although I do work with patients with Huntington's disease,
Like me.
is the tests need to be standardized ultimately in, even if they're not perfect for research purposes, it's if we want to compare like with like, and or ultimately we're all faced with a future where results are going to go digital into some sort of database, whether it's run by a central health service or whatever, that may be, and this is not my strong suit, it might be a good focus for this group to work on what are the right tests for the right condition and what are the right parameters. And as you say, you mentioned anti-saccades, and that's something we do a lot of. And of course, if you have 5 people, there'll be 6 opinions on the best way to do an anti-saccade test. So I don't know whether that's feasible or reasonable, but it seems to me that if you are going to have tests, clinical tests, then there should be some level of agreement as to what tests to run.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think in some of these areas, there's been kind of a rush to market without actually the sort of validation of the tests being used, or not even being clear what tests are being used. So I think that would be a really useful thing to do.
Yeah, there's also a number of instruments that use eye movement responses to measure visual performance, including visual fields and various and there are lots of those rattling about, and they all have a different approach, and they all need to be standardized in different ways, and not all of them have a normative database, which is another issue that seems to me has to be of clinical importance. What are you comparing the result with? So as I say, I'm just weighing in because there's been silence, but very, very happy to take a back seat at this point, just to provoke some thinking about what we might focus on, but not trying to set any kind of agenda.
There is Andreas who has the hand up, and I think he wants to contribute to the discussion.
Yeah, well, what most frequent application of eye tracking is here is the head impulse tests in the dizziness outpatient clinic. We have about 1,000 recordings per year, and it's we are in close contact to most of the dizziness clinics in Europe and in the US, and it's nearly standardized how to applicate it, but there are some parts that could be recommended to do. The calorics irrigation is standardized for, I think, more than 30-40 years right now. So this is the most frequent application. Even with the ENT department, they do it as well. They do it sometimes a little bit different, but yeah, there is somehow a common agreement. I don't know whether it's important to take this part of, meanwhile, quite frequent application of tracking in this consortium. Just thinking.
Matt, I think you.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm not going to try and just steer the discussion, but I just want to provide some context in the previous meeting. So John talked about providing lists of tests that should be performed in certain circumstances, and actually that is one of the things which was discussed. Although the kind of initial thinking around ISCET was to do with analysis pipelines and protocols. In the discussions in the first meeting, we discussed certain conditions might require additional clinical tests to be performed. So taking the example that many of us know in nystagmus, there'd be what kind of visual acuity tests are you going to do and all those sorts of things. So the scope of ISCET, at least so far, has been agreed would probably include those things. One thing that you mentioned, John, though, which hadn't been mentioned before, was the use of normative databases. And of course, they don't exist for everything yet. And often they're quite limited in their scope to a particular device or circumstance. And that may well be something that ISCET could tackle as well, alongside. I mean, at the moment, the kind of mission statement, which I think is to be discussed today, was providing standards and representing the clinical eye tracking field. But I think possibly, we might consider normative database production as being another thing. The only other thing I wanted to just mention briefly, of course, is that it would be helpful to get a sense of how we can characterize international current usage of eye trackers. So we know that there's a wide range of different conditions that these are used in. And we discussed those in the last meeting. We've got a good list as well today, which I could put together later on. But also, aside from the people who are here, what can we do to actually get a clear sense of what's going on outside of the four walls of Zoom that we see here? Would be helpful as well. Thank you.
Hi, Flores, can I come in?
Yeah, come on.
Thank you. So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that were said there. And again, some of this reflects the way that ISCET has gone about a similar process, but obviously several years ago. It's quite hard as a group of clinician scientists to necessarily stipulate to our medical colleagues, some of whom might also be here, what tests should be done under which circumstances. I'm not sure that's necessarily directly helpful. I think that a better approach to it would be, if you are interested in these clinical areas, then this test might help you, and here is a minimum standard for conducting that test. The way ISCET went about this is to write the standards for each of the individual tests that we're responsible for. But we do have an overarching guideline developed by clinicians which discusses conditions and which tests might be useful for investigating them under which circumstances. It's not a direct one-on-one, obviously, because every patient presents differently, and you can't be completely prescriptive about the order of tests. So that was the first thing. The other thing is about reference data. I think normative is an outdated term that's possibly not used very much, and certainly in laboratory science ditched it back in the 1960s, partly because it's slightly pejorative. But reference data is a really important area. One of the things that we're trying to undertake in electrophysiology of vision is a reference data task force that allows us to draw on central pools of data instead of reverting to the heart-sinking phrase, each centre must collect its own, which to do properly is unworkable, except in the very largest and best resource of centres. And there are other really good examples of this being done in other areas. A really great example is respiratory medicine, where something like 72 international centres collaborated and used some data scientists to combine their data into central databases. And having that as an objective from the outset, I think would serve ISCET really well.
Okay.
Gemma, I think, has the hand up.
So I'm a clinical orthoptist, but I'm aware orthoptics is very different in different countries all around the world. And it's very interesting being on these meetings, listening to everybody and talking about their different regional and country specific setups. So I wondered whether in the very beginning for ISCET, rather than as just introducing ourselves on Zoom and writing a list of where we all are, is whether we wanted to gather some kind of baseline data from our interested membership to try and understand who we all are, where we all are, and what we are actually doing locally. Not to say somebody's doing it right or wrong, but to try and understand our kind of where we're all starting from, because I really think that will help the group kind of understand each other, and also then what is the next sensible step, because everybody's suggesting very useful ideas of what to aim for, but it feels like they're very big aims, and it's going to take us probably a series of smaller steps to get there. So I wondered whether anybody was also interested in whether it be a survey, questionnaire, whatever, to try and gather some understanding data from our membership as a first course of action.
Happy to help with that.
Yeah, so that will be linked with what you were saying, Matt, about trying to understand actually internationally how is eye tracking being used, and then if we have a bit of background about what's everyone doing in terms of their clinical work or their research work, as well as where they are based and their profession, if they're orthoptist or neurophysiologist or optometrist or ophthalmologist, that would help, I suppose, to get those the understanding that we need to start with. I suppose is it the only way we can do like some sort of questionnaire to everyone who registered an interest on the society, or because at the moment there's 12 participants, and the previous meeting we were around 20 to 30.
Yeah, the first meeting was 70, second meeting was 20.
70.
Yeah, the very first one. Yeah, I mean, that would be helpful. I wonder how we would actually expand beyond just those people that are interested in these meetings. I mean, I think we've got more researchers than clinicians here at the moment, and that may be a result of the time of day that we've chosen for at least the European colleagues, or the word hasn't spread out enough to clinicians who we really need to be involved in this. But I think a survey is a good starting point, although it won't capture the people that aren't currently on board. And that's... But
we could get ethical approval for that, to kind of put it out wider than just the interested people on the meeting. I heard a couple of the groups now talk about our very kind of diverse clinical areas, so we could have ethical approval to promote that wider, with you've listed a number of different clinical groups there, but I'm sure that there's even more people out there. Even thinking about the audiovestibular people, there's probably quite a lot of people recording eye movements for different purposes. So it feels like we could use our networks to cast our net a bit wider, I feel.
I wonder if we could do anything on the ARVO mail-outs if we got approval, because there's, I forget what it's called, but that's sort of ARVO discussion list that goes out sort of semi-regularly, or other organizations. That
would certainly cover the ophthalmology side of things. I can tell you that the networks which originally this was promoted on was Dr. Z's lecture list. Gemma, you put some information out via the orthoptic clinical and research channels as well? Ruth put some information out via CEVNet and the Pediatric Ophthalmology list server. And I also posted on the iMovement list for the JASC mail group and so on. That's how I've been promoting this so far. And obviously we did have 70 people at the last version of this meeting, so I wonder whether it was not of interest. There was a lot of interest shown at the last meeting, but I don't know whether a little bit more needs to be done in terms of getting people on board so we can get those views gathered. Sorry, I think I've spoken over. John was going to go next.
John, yeah.
Yeah, I was just following on. I agree with what was just said. I'm just following on Ruth's statement. Just to clarify, I wasn't suggesting for a moment that we dictate what tests have to be run for various conditions, but rather that we work towards at least standardizing tests to some extent, or at least agreeing on the basics of a test, because otherwise, whatever you want to call the thing you're comparing it against, whether normative is outdated or whether you call it whatever you want to call it, you have to have a comparator. So you have to have something that tells you that it's an outlier or that it's beyond the expected range. I'll avoid the word normal or typical. So I just think it's a trivial point, but I just think if you don't have a standardized test, then if you've done your anti-saccade test one way and somebody else does it another way, then your error rates are going to be different and various other things. So I'm just pointing out the obvious in a sense that my motivation was to maybe just highlight that we need to standardize these things a little bit so that we can actually collect the data Ruth's talking about that we can make the comparison with.
Yeah, appreciated, Jonathan. Yes, understand. What I was thinking was that Gemma's point is really well made, and really what we need is more data about us. And I feel like at the moment, I know Matt's doing a lot of work driving this, and I appreciate that Flores and others have chaired these meetings. But it almost feels like a good place to get to next would be a committee who have specific roles, and then that subtasks are delegated to individuals on the committee to recruit their own group to drive them forward. Because I'm aware that an awful lot of the effort is falling onto a few individuals, but I think collectively the much wider group probably does have more resource and energy to devote to it.
Ruth, I know at the last meeting you discussed that there were 3 groups for ISEV, Americas, Indo-Pacific region, and then did you say it was it Europe generally was the other one?
So we call them Europe and Africa. Well, we don't just call them that, they are that. Europe and Africa, the Americas, and Asia and Australasia.
Right. And I guess, yeah, having kind of a structure for getting the word out might help. At least if we're going to then do some kind of survey sort of thing.
If I could jump in a quick second, going back to Matt, what you were saying about people, that we had a lot of people at the first meeting, it's gone down. I know I bumped into some of the people from SR Research who are really interested and continually interested, but I think perhaps the effort of finding the website and joining the mailing list and stuff has perhaps just a few people have fallen out along that kind of step. So if we were to do some kind of questionnaire or data gathering to the original list of interested people, I suspect we'd pick up a lot more than a coming along, perhaps.
Okay. And in the initial meeting, there was a kind of email list of people who expressed an interest from the methods reporting thing that I've been doing, and I written to all of them last week. I can't actually tell if anyone here was on that. Just a reminder to kind of shift over if they could to that meeting. Maybe it's just at the moment I've just put together a quick website on Google Sites. It's not, there's no official presence as such beyond that. The society only exists because we agree it does, etc. So I guess, yeah, are we talking here about trying to extend the reach of the society so that we can then do this exercise of understanding what people are using their eye trackers for? Is that a useful first step? Is it necessary even?
think at the moment is pretty biased in a way, perhaps, because to my eyes, quite a lot of the people who are now in the meeting are interested in a very similar area, and that's where Gemma was making the point for. There's a lot of orthoptists working in different aspects of eye movements that might also be that are doing other things with eye tracking systems completely different to what the rest of us do. So perhaps it would be a more comprehensive list of priorities if we had a wider audience or a wider community. I don't know if that makes sense.
Just playing devil's advocate, even if we did have a wider number of people at this meeting, how would we actually know we were capturing true international eye tracker use? There would still presumably be some people we'd miss, or we wouldn't, accurately characterize. Maybe that's the best we can do, but I wonder if that could be. Anyone has any thoughts on that? So simply growing the society, is that sufficient for us to then say, right, this is the current clinical usage?
Just to come in on that, Matt, I don't know that we can, but if, as with all other societies, if we are as open as we can and gender a presence that are interacting with all of our clinical colleagues, then I guess it's the best that you can do. I think the point made earlier by Gemma about engaging with those people who are maybe not so ophthalmology led in their research or clinical work. So the vestibular pathway, British Academy of Audiology, etc., etc. I think that would be key, because we risk looking like almost an opposition. Obviously, there's absolutely no interest in doing that. But you don't want to set up two camps who are effectively doing the same tests for different reasons and doing them slightly differently.
Okay, so
what would be the best way to capture all these people? Sorry, Matt, I'll just cut you there, because there might be some of us that don't have any links with clinicians in certain areas, like Gemma was talking about vestibular clinics or other types of clinics and clinicians working there. So what would be the way to capture all these people who are working in a completely different environment?
So I would say we did actually have that. If you look at the meeting link that I put in the chat earlier in this meeting, we had a really good range of people in the meeting that Larry chaired about a month ago. And in the meeting prior to that, we did have a lot more people from a much wider range of disciplines. And for whatever reason, today we seem to be mostly researchers, many of whom are working in nystagmus areas. Gemma, sorry, I'm not showing this. Floors is.
That's okay. I was just going to say that Catherine mentioned the eye tracker companies themselves. I think they've got a very good understanding of who they sell their kit to. So not just SR Research, but we could certainly, ask for their input and who they consider their customers to be, and use that as a kind of coming at the problem from a different end, if you like. It feels to me like we need to gather information about who's doing eye tracking clinically.
That's a good point. I know SR Research definitely maintains just a list of every publication they've seen that's used their eye trackers, right? So that should be a fairly broad way to survey the usage.
Also, some of the companies like Tobii or Smart Eye, they may mention more clinical uses, but their primary markets or business or industry or Smart Eye is driving. So I think that some of them clinical work is fairly peripheral to their main market. Although that might, if they saw there was a market, they might make their products more suitable. For instance, Tobii's stuff is almost entirely a black box. So if they saw that they could sell into that area, maybe they would be a bit more interactive.
I think you were ahead of Matt.
Yeah, I might have missed this because I had a distraction at the door just when Ruth was making her statement, but I wondered whether it might make sense to go to the professional clinical bodies, such as the orthoptics and neurology and ophthalmology, et cetera, so that we, maybe they would be in a good position, not necessarily to distribute a questionnaire, although that's another possibility, but maybe we could get a take on what they see as the clinical uses for eye tracking or its future. That would at least go part of the way to meeting Matt's concern that we're at least touching base with all the possible clinical uses, because I'm sure a lot of people have had the experience I've had, that you give a talk about eye tracking and there's a clinical audience and immediately they raise their hand and say, can we send our patients to you? And I'm just wondering, well, what do you want me to do with them? So anyway, just a thought, and I apologize if Ruth said that already.
Matt, do you have the?
Yeah, so we can pick up on the point about the manufacturers, like SR Research, for example, do publish the list of all of the studies on their website. But as Larry pointed out, at the moment, the clinical usage is quite low, and that's partly because of the fact that eye trackers are not licensed for clinical use. So anyone who's using it is using it off-label. This is something we actually discussed in the last meeting, but of course that was a different time zone to most people here. And one of the major benefits of ISCET existing as a voice for people who are doing this is that it will hopefully show the manufacturers that we have we have people that want to do this. But I just wanted to point out, if we took the approach of looking at published articles, that doesn't necessarily tell you the clinical uses. I do like John's suggestion, though, of approaching the clinical bodies themselves and maybe trying to get a representative from each of them to one of these meetings and say, look, we need to know what's going on here. You could do it for, I guess there'll be clinical representative bodies in many different countries for many different disciplines. How we organize that is another matter to discuss. Anyway, thank you.
Her hand up, but I don't know whether her point was already made by somebody else or there was a no.
No, I was just agreeing with Jonathan said what I wanted to say was we could approach the neuro-ophthalmologists, the pediatric ophthalmologists, particularly the ones that seek nystagmus patients. And then we've got our new group, Matt, haven't we, that we can contact. And they're about to publish the practice points, aren't they, for nystagmus? I'm not sure whether we can approach them as well somehow.
Mm-hmm. Or
publish in BJO or whatever, or even I, and for different countries, different local journals.
Andres?
I want to emphasize Jonathan's approach. So if we take come from the manufacturers, they sell a system, but who says that the customer is using the system as it is intended from the company? So some people do really a lot of stuff with eye tracking system they were not built for. I think the idea just coming from the disciplines and from the subdisciplines and just what is the area what they use their eye tracking for is the most suitable way to come with the problem.
Okay, just to highlight that Gemma has added in the chat that if we are keen to do this, I suppose is the questionnaire, Gemma, to try and gather the information from other people working in eye tracking. She's happy to be part of the working group serving clinical eye tracking use. So there we are. Thanks, Gemma. There's Ruth.
Thanks, Flores. Just to come back on Andreas's point, I completely agree with that, and exactly the same thing holds for clinical electrophysiology equipment or visual field testing. We can't be responsible for individuals' use of tests. That's down to their own professional practice and license to practice. But where you can make a huge difference is by having a clearly written standard that explains the best way to do the test. It's just not possible to go further than this. It's a debate that we've had in ISCET lots of times as well, when people have talked about, well, what's the minimum training you should have before you should do electrophysiology, and should we somehow, as a clinical society, be signing people off as competent? And the answer is simply always no, you can't do any of that. The resource required to do that sort of thing is just absolutely beyond the stretch of any voluntary clinical organisation, and especially internationally when regulations vary so greatly between countries. So I've sympathised with the point, but I think we can do no more than say this is how the test should be done.
Thanks, Ruth. Fatima?
Yes, just sort of carrying on from what Ruth's saying. To be honest, in lots of ways, eye movements are a lot more intricate and complex than electrophysiology. Particularly if you're looking at children, our eye movement kit, essentially, we don't get to use it anymore because you have to work so quickly with babies. So I think another thing that might be really useful for whoever's going to read our standards is I think, as you said before, for different conditions, we try and lay out the different oculomotor systems that we should look at, like the saccadic system, the pursuit system, and what we would expect in different conditions, like with amblyopia, you might have nasotemporal asymmetry if you're looking at amblyopia, or if you have saccade initiation failure, look at locking up in OKN, or inability to make saccades, and pursuit asymmetries in lots of different conditions. So I think it'd be quite nice to have a set of different clinical conditions. I'm mainly talking about pediatrics here. That might be useful. And then even when you don't have a recording system, then the scientists, the electrophysiologist, or the ophthalmologist would know what to try and elicit from the patient. Again, I'm just talking about pediatrics here, really, where it might not be possible to actually record the eye movements themselves. So you can actually see pursuit asymmetry or OKN asymmetry if you have an OKN stimulus. You can try and look to see if there is an oculomotor apraxia, saccade initiation failure. So I think we could maybe have a subsection where it's not just the complex eye tracking recording systems that there exists, on the market, but just to actually have a clinical point-by-point publication or something like that.
Thanks, Fatima. Matt?
Yeah, just going back to the idea of having a condition list, I think one of the things, if we're going to approach clinical bodies, we're going to need to know which conditions we are, or which clinical bodies to approach. We've spoken a lot about eyes and orthoptics and ophthalmology, but of course there is psychiatry is involved in this to an extent. There are other there are other things to consider too. So I just wanted to point out that we will need to identify a comprehensive list of conditions before we can then go approaching those bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and if no one else is speaking, I will just add to that again, the link in the chat that I put at the beginning of the meeting, if you scroll near the bottom of the page, there's a long list of, I'll paste the list of disciplines here. This is the list of disciplines of the people who were present at the last meeting, the one that Larry chaired. So that's quite a nice, well-rounded group, I think, in terms of the diversity of what was present. But of course, that doesn't break it down into things like, well, audiology is there actually, that sort of thing. Anyway.
Did you record the list of disciplines for the other meetings, or it was only for the Pacific one you did?
It was only for the last one because there were 20 people. It was much more manageable than the first meeting. Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't recall having answered anything related to the discipline. But
we don't know what we don't know, and in terms of we may be missing an entire discipline that we didn't realize, or using eye trackers for some other reason. So that but that should give us a good idea.
Optometry isn't in there, and several of us are employed by it.
Yeah, that's true.
Hmm.
Could I just a small point about getting people to the meeting? We've talked a lot about the time of day. Can you remind me, has it been on different days of the week?
Thus far, it's always been on Wednesdays.
The difficulty there is that certain disciplines, clinical disciplines, they each have a different day where they break. I mean, ophthalmology in Britain, it tends to be a Friday. And so I'm just wondering if it might also make sense to move the day of the week now and again to try to capture people who are never going to be available on a Wednesday, if it's always on a Wednesday. I know each of us have our constraints, but we might just be alive to the fact that I doubt many British ophthalmologists could join this meeting on a Wednesday. So that's just for what it's worth.
Can I also just pick up the point about having an American group as well? We then have the 3 groups mirroring ISEV. Does that seem like a good idea? I mean, I feel like we're not seeing a lot of American colleagues here. Obviously, Robert's here today, and we did have a few more at the first meeting, but I guess we're obviously a group of people who aren't from America, so it's hard to.
So that would be a separate meeting you are suggesting to have a separate meeting to try and accommodate their.
Yeah, so what we've done so far, the first meeting was at this time. So the second meeting was ended, at least for UK, it was 7 a.m., but it was amenable to the kind of, as Larry called it, East of Suez group, and then we'd have a kind of a third time slot which would be centered on America, the Americas and Canada and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So
I don't know, Matt, maybe you should stay up for 24 hours and do 3 meetings in sequence.
Yeah.
Yeah. Andreas, you've just sent a direct message to me, so I'm going to just send this back to everyone, which is the things not on the list. I guess that was not deliberate. Yeah. So we've got a list of potential groups, or at least conditions to focus on, and then it's a case of identifying societies, and then societies in every country in the world, those that have these societies at least, to approach. Sorry, Flores, I'll hand back to you because I feel like I'm sort of starting to take over again, which I'm trying to avoid.
That's fine. I suppose that is then the idea of trying to do what Gemma was saying, trying to get some sort of survey out there, but how would we still get to those people who are not currently involved in this? And I don't know what Catherine was saying about trying to find the information about the meeting and so on, if there's a way to improve all that.
So the mailing list at present is not the most intuitive to sign up to. I appreciate that. It's the only one that I've found which that I'm aware of. This is one of the things we brought up at, I think, the first meeting, was how can we keep everyone in touch? Because at the first meeting, everyone heard about it through various channels and then dissipated. And then we're like, come on, we want to hold on to the people so they can actually continue to spread the message. I guess I would just ask that if everyone here could try and do a bit of promotion of, the aims and contact colleagues after this. For the time being, it's a case of sharing the link to the website and sharing a link to the mailing list sign up, which, by the way, is a group mailing list. I think all the messages so far have come from me, but the reason I set it up in that way was that everybody can talk to everybody. I'm trying not to lead this in any way. Eventually, I would love to see committees emerge that sort of, so this takes a life of its own on. So you can all post to that to have discussion. But yeah, if there are any other ideas for better ways of getting people on board than the current mail list and Google sites, that would be helpful.
So go ahead, Andreas, go ahead.
yeah, the idea of the survey is quite reasonable. So what should we do to promote the survey? Who is going to do something for that, and who is organizing it? So just to go ahead, for summer is approaching and holidays is approaching. So if we want to go do something, yeah, what to do and who organizes it?
So I guess there's two parts to that.
Somebody mentioned that we had to get ethics to do that survey. Is that correct?
Do we?
I mean, I would have thought it would be a safer bet to get some sort of ethical, which means some center has to run the thing, because there's got to be some responsibility for maintaining the names and the data and everything else. So I would have thought that get that first and then use all the means of communication you've used in the past to advertise the first meeting. And I think that would probably hit up, or maybe the clinical organizations as well. But again, that's in many countries, so I'm not quite sure how to handle that.
Ruth?
Yeah, I heard Gemma mention ethics as well, and I was a bit puzzled by that. Maybe Gemma could explain. What we're proposing to do requires no more ethics than everything we've done up to this point, which is to engage with people who are already signed up to mailing lists through different organizations and therefore willing to respond, which is entirely voluntary. For agencies that are working in Europe, I get that we have to follow GDPR, but again, if you're already signed up, then you're already GDPR compliant, and you're entirely free to ignore an email which you were entitled to be sent, and not respond to a questionnaire link that's in it. So I'm not clear about the ethics thing. Thanks, Gemma.
I was assuming ethical approval would be required because we may want to publish the findings.
Yeah. So again, that it's slightly different thing from ethics, isn't it? Because that a GDPR data acquisition issue doesn't require ethical committee review, which is restricted to data which may be gathered about patients. I think that's where
so here at the university, for anything, even just a survey, we would get university ethical approval for that. So say, for example, I set it up and ran it through Sheffield, I would just submit it to, for University of Sheffield ethical approval. That's what I was meaning.
Yeah.
Not
Okay.
research, is it?
Okay.
Because I think that what Ruth is saying here is that it's if it's research based, or if it's something to do with research, then you need the ethical approval. But Gemma, you are implying that for anything we do that has some data, even if it's all completely anonymous.
Yeah, so for example, here at the University of Sheffield, they take I keep hearing the phrase much broader definition of research. Okay. So I wouldn't want to put anything out from me if it hadn't gone through our university ethics. I noticed Mario had a hand up as well.
Yeah, Mario.
It was just to reinforce that in Strathclyde we do exactly the same. An activity such as this would require ethical approval simply because you are collecting human data, you're processing it, you're storing it. So even though you're not using patient data, nevertheless it would require ethical approval, which is normally a very simple thing, simply because all you're saying is we're not putting anyone at risk, but at least it's recorded. It's a process that has been defined, examined, scrutinized, and recorded. So yes, my understanding is that ethical approval is required, even though it's going to be extremely simple to get it.
Yeah, my institution would want at least someone to ask them and say, hey, I don't think this is research. Can you just clarify that and say that, okay, it's fine that we're doing this? Because we're like, it's not a systematic investigation, so it doesn't count as research. And then they would probably sign off on that just on that grounds. But I mean, this is in the US, so it may be very different. But they would want to hear about it, yeah.
Ruth?
The review board, yeah. Oh, sorry.
No problem. So I guess that's a slightly different thing. I mean, I have my head in NHS and IRS applications and the many months of tentacles that involves. But I understand your point, Gemma. Surely the way around this is simply to drive this from an institution that doesn't require.
Yes, to give an idea of the timescales, in a place like Strathclyde, this would be a 2-week process that requires filling in a 3-page form. So it's not something to be scared of. It is, however, something to be done.
So no, absolutely not to be scared of. But I guess what I'm concerned about then is if we're saying one single institution becomes responsible for this very broad data gathering exercise that we're doing, then that then makes it beholden on individuals in that institution to lead on all of the data gathering strands that we've talked about. And that's not necessarily going to overlap with everyone's networks.
Yes, but in any case, you need to define a data processor, even if it's not for GDPR. So,
can I suggest that even if it was with one person or one organization leading it, you could still have everyone else advertising the study. They don't have to be collecting data, but they could at least contact their networks and say, it would be really great if you could, you could sign up to this study, which is being hosted at Sheffield, for example.
Yeah, but that's what Ruth is saying, right? That it would be all responsible. Sheffield would be responsible of all the data holding, right? Or
yeah, I mean, yeah, that's.
Well, we're saying Sheffield as an example.
I know.
I think sorry. I'm not sort of dragging you into this.
Gemma, very happy to have the conversation here in Sheffield and just say, look, is this something we can do? Because it's my understanding that it would be required from an organisation anyway. I wouldn't be suggesting that this is my institution holding the data for absolutely everything. The ethical approval would just be limited to the data the kind of survey data at present. So this would just be step one, rather than taking responsibility for a much larger future, bigger scale project. So this survey as a discrete piece of work.
Why when we talk about ethics everything goes silent. Yeah, I suppose now the next question is like, is this something that we are trying to take on to actually do a survey and request some ethical approval? Or
I think if it's going to help us to understand the scope of what ISCET is dealing with, I think it would be a useful thing to do. And if we do that in the context of an academic study and potentially it's publishable, then that's going to presumably get a bit more engagement from people from ISCET. As that, publications are always good, at least for the researchers here. Bearing in mind, though, this is meant to be primarily a clinical group, so it may be that driving it in the direction of a research study is not where we want to go. But certainly as an incentive to get people on board to help out with the collection and understanding. But is that going to move things at a snail's pace when all we really want to do is find out who we want to engage and move things along quicker? That's worth balancing up. Anyway, I would be in favor of doing it if that helps. That would be a way to tackle this if there's no other suggestions on the table, and then we at least would know what clinical disciplines are involved. But we would need to understand what is it we're going to be asking people. We're just saying, what patients do you see? Do we want to know how many are you seeing at any given time? Are we going to have a pre-structured questionnaire? How is that data going to be synthesized? And then ultimately, is that actually going to lead us to the aim of the whole point in this exercise is to understand which clinical disciplines should ISCET first be producing standards for. And I see that a scoping exercise to understand what eye trackers are being used for is definitely going to be a useful ground foundation rather for anything that happens afterwards. But yeah, if anyone else has any thoughts in terms of whether that's just going to move things along too slowly, or whether it particularly matters if it happens slowly, or we can do other things in parallel.
Yeah, Matt, this is the great idea. Should we, or may you open such an open document as the standards, just for everyone to work on it, and just the ideas that you just mentioned, writing down, and then everyone can add some things that we can have a prescript for a survey. So if you have a prescript, the survey is quite easy to do. But when you have the structure, so that everyone could share or add some points to that.
So you're suggesting starting a collaborative document, which is the outline for a survey, and people can add questions that they think would be useful. Maybe we can have a table of organizations that we know we could potentially approach. And then I don't know if Gemma is feeling keen to at least check out with the ethics board and be the host for potentially then actually administering that survey, although everyone else here could then helpfully distribute that to their networks and point them to the study, even if they're not active researchers in that study. And of course, then that could be a collaborative publication if we decide that we're going to go down that route of saying here's an international survey of clinical eye tracker usage. Personally, I think that would actually be quite a useful publication to have, because it gives a formal backing to the existence of ISCET and what we then do afterwards.
So is there are there some action points there for Matt and Gemma then? I'm just allocating some work to do.
The document, and Gemma,
Gemma, are you happy to check with? Oh, sorry, Matt.
No, sorry, you're chairing this. It
was just whether Gemma was happy to check with her ethical.
Yeah, I can do that. I can do that. Yeah.
Even if it's just checking to see what would be the requirements and process.
That's fine. Thanks.
Yeah, link. So can I just jump in and ask that if people could share the following links with anybody who they think might be interested. This is the link to the main website. And then the other thing is to sign up to the mailing list. This is kind of the crucial one, is that second link there. And that would potentially help to get more people on board with this. And I'd also just want to ask, is there anybody here who would like to chair the next meeting from this region? And I would also ask, should we do the next meeting based in an American time zone, or do we want to flip back to the Eastern time zone first and then do an American one? Any thoughts on that?
I think it'd be good to at least try and get an American one, because there's a lot of eye movement related clinical work there has been done in the US, and in the rest in Canada, Latin America, we're not getting much representation. So I think it'd be good to try and get people there. Maybe promote it to NANOS, some other relevant bodies.
Robert, how would you feel about sharing a meeting? Says putting you on the spot.
I'm gearing up to start a new position, so it's maybe.
Right, that's fine.
Timing and stuff.
I can have a word with some other colleagues over there and see if we can find somebody who might be interested. I'll have a look at the previous attendees list as well, because we've.
I'm not saying no. I'm just saying I have to.
Okay.
I'd have to think about it and figure it out. Yeah.
Right.
Just to clarify, the two links that you have copied on the chat, one is to register on the mailing list, and the other one is to...
It's just the general website that I'm currently updating.
General website. Yeah, because I remember in the previous meeting, in the previous Europe time zone meeting, my colleagues from the university where I work were here, but no one is here today, so I'm not sure where they've gone, because I saw them this morning, and I thought that they were aware of this, so I'll share that with them so they can join back into this. Yeah.
I actually have another meeting to go to, so are we kind of done at this point, or have we reached whatever decisions we have to make for now? Somebody?
I think we had two action points, and then the last thing we were discussing was the meeting with US. So is that going to be a Europe and US joint meeting?
I will take forward to to identify what time zone we want to be using, and well, obviously we can try and aim for an America's one. I will have a word with. I'll look at the attendee list from the previous meetings and see if I can work out people who might be suitable and try and approach them for those. I'm hoping that in time we'll have lots of people volunteering to do one meeting here or there, or we might just have key hosts for the 3 regions. I know that's one of the things we spoke about last time, Larry, wasn't it? Is that it might be better just to have people representing each area rather than trying to continually pass the baton around, which might be a bit disorganized. But I'm quite keen that this be a community effort and not led by any particular group or individual per se, but if we have separate regions, then that seems reasonable. And maybe, Ruth, we could learn a bit more about how ISEV does things in terms of coordinating that, because I think for something like this to succeed, it needs to be, people looking at it from the outside need to see that this is a transparent organization that people buy into collectively, and you haven't got 1 or 2 voices trying to dominate. So yes, I will speak to colleagues that I'm aware of in America who have been to previous meetings and ask if they would be willing to chair. Although, Robert, if you do get any better understanding as to whether or not you might be able to, it's really helpful to have that thread of having been at the previous meeting. And I think you were at the first meeting as well, right?
No, actually, I missed the first one. I was on the earlier the minimal reporting stuff.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Sorry, Flores.
No, that's any other business?
Nope.
All right. Well, thank you, Flores, for sharing. Really appreciate it.
No, thanks for inviting me, Matt. Take
Good
care,
to see
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.